Um, so hello everyone. I hope you're all well and settled down for what I hope will be at the very least an informative talk. But in case it proves otherwise, do make sure you've got your drinks at the ready. Don't forget you've got two hands for a reason, so I won't judge you if you double up, especially if the talk gets a bit dry for you. So let's begin. So my name's Miles. I'm the lecturer in engineering and a fellow here. I'm the director of studies in engineering for Part 1A and admissions at Homerton. So it's my job to keep an eye on our first year engineers and make sure they're up to the job and make sure we select the ones that are up to the job. So if they're not, it's my fault. But on a sort of day-to-day basis, I'm a nuclear engineer. I did nuclear engineering as my degree, and then I went and worked for Rolls-Royce, contracted by the Ministry of Defence on the submarines. So my job was designing the next generation of nuclear submarine, the ones with the ballistic missiles on them. Although I wasn't involved with the ballistic missiles aspect, I was involved with the steam generation plant, so the actual bit, nuclear reactor, the bit that gets the submarine moving. And I did that for 2 years, realized I quite missed being a student. We'd finished the design of the new set of submarines. So as a physicist, there's not much point hanging around at that point. So I quickly made my escape and did a PhD at Cambridge. Did my PhD in looking at hydrogen embrittlement and hydrogen interactions, which is quite a big thing in the nuclear industry. It's one of the reasons why you saw an explosion at Chernobyl and an explosion at Fukushima is because of hydrogen. And we can talk about that during the Q&A. And I quite liked getting my hands stuck into research myself and being in the lab, which is not something you get to do that much of as an engineering manager. So I stayed around. I got offered a postdoc position looking at nuclear safety, paid for again by the Ministry of Defence. The aim was to retain nuclear expertise in the UK for the near future. And so I worked on something called small modular reactors, which are a new type of reactor that afford some safety improvements and a little bit more cost effective for those that don't have enough money to buy a large plant. And again, I'll mention these briefly in the talk, but we can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A. And then I arrived at Homerton. So Homerton offered me a lectureship. So I jumped to the opportunity there. Originally, I was at Jesus. I was Director of Studies for Natural Sciences at Jesus. Came over to Homerton and they've never looked back. So I'm very happy in this college at the moment. But it's quite a fitting day to have this talk because today is Earth Day. So a day when we're supposed really to show support for environmental protection. So what better day really is there to discuss climate change and nuclear power? The reason behind this talk is really to sort of spark a discussion wherever you are about our role in steering society towards a more sustainable future, not just in terms of government policies and global strategies, but as individuals ourselves, in terms of how we ensure we're adequately informed on important topics, and how we continue to seek the truth despite the perpetual manipulation that we see day to day in the media. And how we consider our personal contributions to climate change, what values we try to instill in younger generations and what pressures we apply on policymakers will play a pivotal role in our fight against climate change. Now, the COVID pandemic has reminded everyone really that science is essential to our survival, which is obviously a good thing. But it's also shown us that global policies that command global acceptance can be used to optimize social and economic stability. And nowhere is the need greater for such science and global policy change than in the fight to survive climate change. But we're not really in a sort of similar challenge to COVID. This isn't really like COVID. We don't have a vaccine. Much like when any disasters occur, immediate efforts should be made to ensure we have a reliable and resilient supply of essential goods. In that way, we are similar. be it food, water, electricity, or in terms of climate change and most prevalent to this talk, energy. So the first part of my talk will be talking about the climate and that essential requirement of energy. So energy is, of course, the essential good, not just for man, but for life in its entirety. Plants have taken energy from sunshine for billions of years. Dogs are allowed to chase their sticks thanks to the energy obtained through the digestion of their food. And then mankind, some 600,000 years ago, tired of the energy limitations of their own digestive systems, started to take advantage of external energy sources through the use of oxen and teams of horses. And man continued to do that for hundreds of thousands of years, from wood fires to water mills. But if we fast forward to around just 250 years ago, we see a scale of external energy use like had never been seen before, when we arrived at the Industrial Revolution. And with the Industrial Revolution came huge amounts of energy, available anytime, anywhere, and causing arguably the biggest change to human culture ever seen, with global politics and economics pretty much determined solely by those who had access and those that didn't to the world's oil and gas supply. And that global transformation really was a rapid revolution. And that's something we need to embrace once again in our current time. For with climate change, we necessitate an even greater revolution. And again, energy is at the forefront. As I'll argue in this talk, if man is to survive climate change, it's going to require not just a technological transformation, but a transformation in education and lifelong learning. Trouble changing that. There we go. So I know we're living in a pandemic, but even ignoring that, if it often seems there's never really any good news nowadays, at least not to me when I watch the news. Each year things seem to get worse. If it's not the hottest day on record, again, it's forest fires, fires in Australia, hurricanes in the US. And the saddest truth is really, we knew this was coming for decades. Decades we've understood that rapid climate change is the result of greenhouse gas emissions, but instead of reducing such emissions, we increase them by about 50% in the last 20 years. And they continue to go up. So why don't we just stop? Well, as population increases and economies grow, we need more energy. That's obvious. And in acquiring that energy, we produce that CO2. I could take up the entire talk going into, the factors of economic growth and population size and their, influences on climate change. But what we're really interested in here today is how we can stop it. And that comes down to the amount of energy we use and where it comes from. So first, let's look at the energy that we use, or really how efficiently we use it. Let's take, if some of you have already eaten your dinner, presumably tonight, so take your dinner this evening. It's a nice sunny day. Maybe one of you had a barbecue, and in order to have that barbecue, you might have burnt some coal to cook your kebabs, whereas another one of our participants may have used an electric induction hob powered by nuclear energy. Obviously, down the line, I don't expect you to have an in-house nuclear reactor. If you do, make sure you tell the regulator. Anyway, the barbecue is going to be far less efficient than the electric hob, as much less energy is used by the induction hob to do the same job. The same goes for the kitchen that uses, for example, LED lights rather than old incandescent light bulbs. The LED bulb uses less energy to do the same job, and that's known as energy efficiency. So the more efficient we can be, the less CO2 we produce. No more gas stove, hello, lower carbon footprint. Electric car, hello, lower carbon footprint. And this all seemed quite obvious, simple. So making our technology more efficient and thinking about how we use energy in our society is undoubtedly one of the most important ways to reduce the world's CO2 emissions. But unfortunately, too many of us aren't doing enough. And I mean, both on an individual level, whether you buy an electric car or not, or on an industrial scale, through the electrification of the transport and industrial sectors, as an example. So your role as a member of the public in scrutinizing and holding policymakers to account in both local and national government, pushing industry and considering and discussing our own carbon footprint really is vital in ensuring we are as efficient and carbon careful as possible. And that is vital in our fight against climate change. But is efficiency alone enough to survive climate change? No, unfortunately not. We are too many and too energy intensive. Efficiency could have a huge effect, but there are a number of reasons why it's not the be all and end all. One factor I mentioned is about where the energy comes from, which I'll speak of later. But one important concern is the improvement in efficiency of technology. And that's proven not as beneficial as first supposed. And that's because humans are perpetrators of a phenomenon known as the rebound effect. Now, there's two different types. We've got a direct rebound effect is where, if something is more efficient, we end up using it more. Take planes. As planes became more fuel efficient, ticket prices went down. And so more people started to travel by plane, meaning actually carbon emissions go up. So you improve the efficiency of the plane, but actually carbon emissions go up. An indirect rebound effect might be I save money using an electric car, so I spend the money saved on an extra holiday, including its plane journey, or you buy yourself an unnecessary gift that itself has to be manufactured, transported, and so on, leading to, in some cases, a greater carbon footprint than if you were to have stuck with your inefficient tech in the first place. Meaning you might actually burn more CO2 through buying your electric car than if you'd stuck with your inefficient Volvo V70. But provided you don't get smug when you do the switch and don't spend your savings on other CO2 emitting activities, you're doing the right thing. Go electric. Just remember, it's not so simple as doing one thing. Be aware of your own perpetration of this rebound effect. And what this shows really is that in order to tackle something as complex as climate change, one must understand the wider significance of everyday actions. And even if you are some omniscient being, fully clued up on your own in-house carbon footprint, efficiency will only go so far anyway. Eventually, you're going to reach a point that efficiency improvements have done all they can, and they become unfavorable and too costly for very little benefit. So really, regardless how efficient we make our world in the long run, as long as we're using energy, we're going to have carbon emissions. So efficiency is only one battle in the war for survival. So what else can we do? Well, that leads us to the most important contribution in the crusade for cleaner energy, and that you hear about it a lot less than efficiency. And that's where the energy comes from, or more specifically, the CO2 released per unit energy generated. Because where is it that we're producing most of our CO2? Well, largely it's in our energy sector. As you can see in the pie chart here, about 73.2% is used in producing our energy. So what are our options? Well, coal produces more CO2 than anything else, any other source, producing around 820 grams of CO2 equivalents per kilowatt hour. Natural gas is better, but it's still a huge producer with photovoltaics, concentrated solar power, wind, and nuclear, frankly, minuscule in comparison. They're the sources we need to be moving towards. Nuclear and wind have the lowest. They're around 12 grams CO2 per kilowatt hour. I mean, those numbers are kind of median values for life cycle emissions. So they include it for those engineers listening, it's including the albedo effect. Solar PV, photovoltaics, is around 50, 48, 50. Concentrated solar's about half that, 27. And hydro's about 24. So hydroelectrics, which is often considered, the best, is actually double that of nuclear power. Nuclear power is about 12 grams per CO2 per kilowatt hour. And this is well-established science. Fossil fuels produce more CO2 than any other source. So the more we burn, the more CO2 we produce. Now, unfortunately, we can't just switch, obviously, off our fossil fuel plants. We need to gradually change. But there needs to be a clear roadmap. And though various pledges and agreements have been signed, such as the Paris Agreement, which the US famously withdrew from under Trump, they've now rejoined under Biden, by the way. The truth is, despite all of those, a lot of it is just keeping up appearances, frankly, and half efforts. Frankly, we're not really doing enough to keep fossil fuels out of our energy networks, and it's the policymakers that are responsible. So what should they be doing? And what should we be doing in terms of what are we demanding? And that's really what I hope we can spark a debate on today. But I'll give my sort of 2 pence. First and foremost, we could cut subsidies to fossil fuel industry. It's shocking that we actually subsidize fossil fuel. We could take that money that we give to the fossil fuel industry and move those funds into supporting greener energy sources such as renewable and nuclear. We could increase the cost or taxes for carbon emissions and continue doing so for the near future. We could leave nuclear reactors online for longer. All those actions would produce an immediate incentive for industry to transition to greener operations and phase out fossil fuels. So you would be actually encouraging efficiency across the board. That includes not just the energy industry, but all industries, from clothing manufacturers to construction. If you set stricter standards for energy efficiency of new products, be they homes, cars, or any other product, and phase out those that are carbon intensive, such as petrol and diesel vehicles, you're going to have a huge reduction in carbon emissions. I mean, if you take a look at Ireland, if you've ever been to Ireland, you might notice that diesel is notably cheaper than petrol, despite the fact that it is still a significant CO2 emitter, not as much as petrol, but it has been shown that increasing the tax on diesel to similar levels that we've got in the UK does have a remarkable effect on reducing emissions. And on a really extreme environment, I suppose if you've ever been to the US, you'll have noticed fuel is incredibly cheap there. It's different countries with different policies, and it's these policies that influence their own carbon emissions. US citizens, because of these kind of policies, produce a much larger amount of CO2 per person than UK citizens, for example. 1 terawatt hour, to give you an understanding what that really means, 1 terawatt hour is about the energy used by 27,000 EU citizens in a year. And given the behavior of US citizens in comparison to EU citizens, the US equivalent of 1 terawatt hour is half that, over half. It's about 12,800 US citizens compared to our 27,000. That's how much more energy they use than us. Now, I'm not going to just blame Americans. Americans aren't the worst. Aside from the outliers shown in this graph, like Qatar, these really are outliers. A lot of these are very small countries, and you can really disregard them in terms of what we're talking about today. We have Arab Emirates and the Saudis, and then they're only, the US are only just beaten in terms of emissions per person by the Australians. Both produce around triple the average. Australians with about 17 tons per year per person, and the US is close behind with about 16, same as the Canadians. But what's interesting is actually our anti-nuclear European neighbour Germany produced double the world average with 10 tons per year per person. That's more than China. And China gets a lot of stick with regards to carbon emissions. China's only got about 7 tons. The UK is below that with about 5.8, so we're not too bad. You know, the average is around 4.7. So the UK is not too bad, but Germany is a little bit questionable. So evidently, from the countries that I'm listing here, you know, it's the richest countries that are the most responsible for carbon emissions. And that's because carbon emissions go up as affluence goes up. A US citizen produces as much carbon dioxide equivalent in under 3 days that an average Nigerian produces in a year. And who do you think will suffer more than climate change? Niger. That's why it's so outrageous when someone like Trump, you know, disregards climate change and promotes his oil-rich buddies' interests. You know, and our leaders must be held accountable. We cannot do this or seek a solution without ensuring we ourselves understand the problem. Instead of promoting fossil fuels, something nation states can do immediately is provide better funding for innovative technology aimed at reducing those carbon emissions, allowing them the opportunity to develop and rival those established but less carbon clean counterparts that currently rule our world. Nation states should cancel the construction of any further fossil fuel plants, really. It's easily done, and you replace them with their greener counterparts. These are things that we can do now. These are things we should be doing now. And these are things we as the public have to ensure or pressure our leaders to do before we no longer have a world to save. And this is a huge revolution. I understand that. As the reality is, we live in a society that's run on fossil fuels. But there is still time to change. And should we revolutionize our understanding, our ideology, and our culture, and actually fight for our planet, you know, the future could be much brighter than the scientists are forecasting today. So if we can't just switch off our fossil fuel plants, you know, how do we progress? How best do we transition to a fossil fuel free infrastructure? Well, to slow climate change, we need to achieve the net zero carbon emissions that you've probably heard about. Net zero 2050, net zero so-and-so. About 75% of greenhouse gas emissions are from energy production, remember, namely fossil fuels. Around 85% of our primary energy, so overall energy use, not just electricity, comes from fossil fuels, mostly oil, followed by coal and then gas. 10% of oil is actually used solely for boilers to keep us warm. 16% is from low emission technology, which includes 7% hydro, 5% renewables, so wind and solar, and biomass is included in that, and 4% from nuclear. So nuclear is actually a bit of a baby here. Well, considering this, if we're going to rid ourselves of oil boilers and other fossil fuel reliant products, the best thing to do is, much like with our cars, turn electric. Why? Because we can make energy in terms of electricity by low emission sources. It's very, very easy. So if we can turn the entirety of our industry electric, we have a far better likelihood of getting low emission energy. Currently, our electricity does itself rely on fossil fuels. 63% of global electricity rely on fossil fuels. 27% renewables, including hydroelectrics in this case, and 10% nuclear. So it really is a huge transition that we need here. Not only that, but the transition gets larger and larger the longer we put it off. You know, in the last 20 years, when climate change has been quite a hot topic, electricity usage increased over 70%. And it's clear that renewables alone are not sufficient to catch up. Renewables have just over doubled their capacity in the last 20 years, but fossil fuels have increased too. And unfortunately, our potential knight in shining armor, nuclear power, has not changed really at all in its capacity. Renewables have increased from about 2.9 to 7 gigawatt hours, nuclear 2.5 to 2.8, and fossil from about 10 to 17. And this means that it all means that emissions are still increasing worldwide from electricity production. Nuclear has a tremendous potential and should have been embraced to prevent this increase in fossil fuel use, but we've stagnated the progression of our nuclear fleets, at least in the West. And this has really proven an absolute disaster in regard to climate change. I highlighted the West because if you take a look at China, it's a very different situation. China has embraced nuclear. Here we go. China has embraced nuclear to limit its increase in fossil fuel use, increasing its capacity from just 16 to 350 terawatt hours, a huge unknown increase. India is pretty good as well, 15 to 45. And South Korea have done something similar. And, you know, South Korea, China, India, they've all done this through building new reactors. And they continue to do that. And they're good at it. When we look at the UK, Germany, and Japan, however, rather than building new reactors, we've been taking them offline. Japan has dropped from a figure similar to China, you know, in the 300s, about 306, to just 66. That's how much they switched off. The UK, nowhere near as bad, but still pretty concerning, it's from about 85 to 55 terawatt hours. And this, again, is an utter disaster in our fight for climate change, the complete opposite, frankly, of what we need to be doing. As a result, now, to take Japan as an example, Japan now ranks as the world's largest importer of liquefied natural gas and is now the second largest importer of coal, just behind China. Now, when you think about the population of China compared to Japan, that's why Japan is having real trouble with its carbon emissions at the moment. But for now, let's kind of focus a little bit on Europe, because most relevant to us is probably Germany. Germany's fallen from 170 to 75 terawatt hours. And Germany is, in my opinion, the worst example of what politics can do with climate change. They capitalized on a broad anti-nuclear sentiment and the policy instruments already in place. And in doing that, they managed to close nuclear plants and instead look to expand their renewables program. And this has been happening since 2011. Of course, it sounds great to the public that renewables are expanding. Perhaps that'll keep those in power comfortably seated for a little bit longer. But the reality is the electric industry has had to cope with the loss of nuclear generating capacity by ramping up production from coal-fired power plants, many of which in Germany burn lignite, which is actually, you know, is the dirtiest type of coal. And that hugely increased their carbon emissions. Now they slowly recovered, but in the hours, you know, in the years rather, following their shutdown of nuclear, their carbon emissions exploded. You know, so how can a government do that with all the declarations and agreements that they sign? How does this even happen? Well, it's a government taking advantage of the public's anti-nuclear sentiment, which itself is a product of the dreadful public communication on nuclear energy in the general media, but even from the nuclear vendors themselves, frankly. And this is something that, you know, we've got to change. We've got to change the public's perception of nuclear. A few days after the Fukushima, after the earthquake and the tsunami that led to the Fukushima accident, there's about 40,000 protesters in Germany formed about a 30-mile long human chain from the city of Stuttgart to a local nuclear power plant to demonstrate the government's plans to extend the life of Germany's nuclear reactors. They were pro-nuclear. They had a very good nuclear program. And the government completely U-turned. Within a few months, Merkel completely changed on nuclear energy. And on June 30th, 2011, Berlin ordered the immediate shutdown of 8 of their 17 reactors, with the rest being taken offline by 2022. The electricity utility was delighted, you know, they cheered. Fossil fuels bring in more money than anything else. So they toasted their benefactors, as within the first year after the German government decided to shut down its nuclear plants, coal production increased by 25 terawatt hours. If you, there's a working paper by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and they analysed the economic and social impact of that nuclear phase out in Germany. And the authors of that estimated that the amount of coal consumption that would have been avoided if they would have kept their nuclear plants going, actually they found the result to be about 32% more coal had been used. And that additional consumption of coal had costed an estimated 1,100 lives due to the increased air pollution in Germany alone. So Germany aren't doing a good job. But, you know, is anyone? Let's look at national emissions. You know, who has the lowest carbon electricity? And the front runners take most of their energy from nuclear and hydroelectrics. So France, let's go with France now. France has a pretty low carbon emission per capita. It's just above the world's average, which is impressive when you think about some of the countries, developing countries, and what they're producing. So why? Why is France so good? Well, France is 10% fossil alone and 67% nuclear, 12% hydro and 11% renewables. Sweden is another one we could look at. They're about 50% hydro, 30% nuclear and 23% renewables. Mainly because of their topography is why they can have so much hydro. And Sweden too has an impressively low carbon emission per capita. So why aren't we doing what the French and the Swedish are doing? The French have proven nuclear can work in such large capacities. Well, why did they manage to do that? Well, they made the decision decades ago to invest in nuclear, and in terms of emissions, it really has worked wonders. The problem is it's not perfect in France. Expansion has slowed. It's slowed across the entirety of the West, even in France, as nuclear struggles to compete really economically with the dirtier counterparts. And it's because of taxes and subsidy problems. Most reactors in the West, due to that lack of investment and political issues, are old technology. And most of them, well, many of them, are soon to be decommissioned. And France is included in that. The majority of the 58 nuclear reactors in Energie de France, EDF's historic fleet, have reached or will reach 40 years of operation within the next 15 years. Each reactor is going to have to then be required to pass some periodic and very comprehensive and expensive safety assessment, and that's due every 10 years of operation in order for them to be authorized to extend its power generation activities. And France isn't alone here. With the lack of action from our politicians and the lack of investment in the past few decades, the nuclear industry has lost a huge amount of expertise, most notably in the UK. A lot of you will remember the UK were once world leaders in advanced reactor design with Doon Ray until Thatcher cut it. Thatcher cut it just at the worst point when it was actually at its most successful. But we've lost most of our expertise in the designing and building of new reactors. We don't do that. We're at the mercy of the French or the Chinese or Japanese. And when you lose that knowledge, building a reactor costs a whole lot of money. And so it's not of appeal to investors. So it's just a spiral. If you look at the OECD, OECD's Nuclear Energy Agency's calculation of how much it costs to run a nuclear reactor, the overnight cost for a nuclear power plant built in the OECD rose from about 2,000 kilowatt electric per kilowatt electric, $2,000 per kilowatt electric at the end of the 1990s. So $2,000 to about 4,000 in 2009. In 2019, EDF estimated that the cost of building 6 of its new European pressurized water reactors, EPR2 units in France in the late 2020s would be at least 56 billion euros. And that is equivalent to about 6,000 euros per kilowatt electric. That's a huge increase in what it cost to build reactors in the 90s. And like I said, France aren't alone in their suffering. In countries where there are fewer reactors being built or they're being retired, construction costs are increasing rapidly. But if you look at this graph, you'll see Asia has actually got quite a low cost. A big part of that is China. They've expanded their nuclear sector. But why is China not having these issues? Well, the Nuclear Energy Authority, the IAEA, produced a roadmap in 2015, and it estimated that China's average overnight costs of approximately $3,500 per kilowatt were more than a third less than in the EU, which was about $6,000. Costs in the USA were about 10% lower than the EU, but they're still 30% higher than in China and India, and it's because the US are suffering by the same thing. They're not building new reactors. South Korea are very similar to China. South Korea aren't as good as the Chinese, but they're still pretty good. In China, it's estimated that building 2 identical gigawatt electric reactors on a site can result in a 15% reduction in the cost per kilowatt compared to if you built a single reactor. And the Chinese know this, and the Chinese can build plants. So they build in bulk, much like India and South Korea. They build them in big numbers, they build them quickly, and they build them to be economically competitive. They're consistently engaging in new build. They have the experience and they're learning. And that's the key. Nuclear must be economically competitive. If nuclear were as cheap as fossil fuels, we wouldn't be in this mess. But you need to build and build consistently. You need long-term commitment. And China has this, but the West has sadly fallen behind. So nuclear can be economically competitive, and it's certainly a large capacity green energy source, but it clearly has problems. But they are problems that are a product of political negligence. Now, some of you are probably thinking, why not just go all out for renewables? I was going to stick on cost, but we're running a little bit behind on time. So simply put, why aren't we running with renewables? Well, frankly, they're just not reliable. You can't produce energy from a wind turbine if it's not windy, or even if it's too windy. In some cases, you might see the news, wind turbines going on fire. Solar can't make electricity if the sun isn't shining. So to use renewables, we need very efficient energy storage systems, hydro or batteries, for example. And that means a huge capacity for energy storage is needed, which at present, we don't really have, and we don't know how to do that effectively. So in the end, we need a mix. And to have that mix, we need to keep nuclear going, at least while we solve the challenges faced by renewables in terms of storing that energy and so on. And we need to improve nuclear technology to solve the issues there. And really, no matter what your stance, the risks climate change pose to humanity cannot be scientifically doubted. If you are going to solve an issue, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. As risk analysis will tell you, you've got to invest in developing both nuclear and renewables. It should be obvious that any technology that affords a solution is worth giving a go. Nuclear is proven to work at high capacity, like we've seen in France. Renewables isn't yet, but it's got the potential. We know nuclear can provide our baseload. We have the technology. We just need the initiative and the investment. We need to see nuclear and renewables really as teammates, not rivals. That the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, they showed that a large increase in the use of nuclear power would help keep global warming to below 1.5 degrees. And they're very vocal about this. But the solution, our net zero by 2050 target, should be explicitly a call for everything and everyone to get on board. And it's not happening. Especially when you see the last 30 years of climate action, has seen emissions continually increase. According to the IPCC, the average of their 4 main possible scenarios, nuclear energy capacity needs to increase 4 to 5 times from its current level. And frankly, I think that's even too small, as those calculations ignored something that you would think was obvious, but the inevitable case that energy consumption will increase as population and economy grows. The problem is the nuclear industry, our policymakers, and the public at large haven't realized the significance of what needs to happen with nuclear growth. And we all need, to really take the initiative. So why? So, how do we change people's minds? How do we engage our audience and call them to action? That's a tricky one, but it's about education. Okay. Now, we live in an attention economy. Honestly, this far into the talk, I'm probably losing some of you. And this means that by talking about one thing initially and losing you, I risk neglecting something that's really important that I'm going to cover later. Some of you will wonder why I haven't mentioned, probably the most common concern in the public's mind with regard to nuclear, safety or its waste. But, that's actually very much intentional. Nuclear is extremely safe, and there is so much information to that effect in the public literature. But still, most communications you'll see from nuclear utilities, nuclear vendors, are almost always about how safe a reactor is. Well, I think that because of our attention economy, when we talk about unproven dangers that can too often dominate discussions in nuclear power, it can actually mean that we neglect something that is well proven to be dangerous. To give you another example, what I've got here, electromagnetic radiation. I see a lot by sort of conspiracy theorists, things like this, so much speculation regarding the hazards of background electromagnetic radiation from your home devices and mobile phones, which many studies have unequivocally refuted. But I don't see anywhere near as much outrage in regard to air pollution. And, that's the air pollution that's linked to 4.2 million deaths per year, by the way. If you completely rid air pollution, scientifically well established, you would say 4.2 million deaths per year. So really what I'm trying to say is, the fear of nuclear is unjustified, but the nuclear industry's public relations continues to be its own downfall and one of the main reasons why people fear nuclear. By talking about, how safe everything is, you miss the important things. In some cases, you can actually raise concerns on safety by highlighting it all the time. It's hard to see the benefits through all the unjustified talk thrown at it. But if we sell the benefits instead of the fear, that's how we can change the discussion on the future of nuclear into an expansive and progressive discussion and begin to tackle climate change far more effectively than we're doing now. One of the problems is the nuclear industry's passive role in debates and how it's determined the way the public sees its technology. That needs to end. Given the critical time we're in climate change, the industry must become active with its communications about the benefits, that nuclear energy can, really contribute to the saving of Earth. Nuclear being a clean energy source, is already obvious through the public literature. And so the problem with anti-nuclear sentiment isn't due to lack of information. Really, it's just a problem of believing that information, believing the information given, and then acting on those beliefs. And to actually believe, throwing data and reports out to the public in a typical way that an engineer would, and I'm speaking as an engineer, so I'm allowed to judge myself, throwing those reports out to the public, proving the science, it isn't enough. There needs to be emotion and an alignment of values, which will turn the information into something that has value. So, why do people dislike nuclear? Well, public discussions have been dominated by the anti-nuclear side for decades. And that's been enabled, like I said, by the absence of the nuclear industry in these discussions. Anti-nuclear groups and spokespersons push their agenda by saying nuclear was dangerous and reckless. And to remediate, the nuclear industry said, oh, we're increasing safety, we're increasing regulation. And in doing so, reinforce the concerns planted by the anti-nuclear tribe. As if the nuclear industry is making things safer, it must be in need of improved safety. That's what people start to think. And so in turn, things must currently be unsafe if they're trying to make everything safer. And every time I see outreach or public discussion or a talk on nuclear, it's inevitable that waste and safety are the primary topic of the speaker, always. And this has certainly contributed to nuclear stagnation. It's hardly inspiring to young engineers and scientists, is it? The nuclear industry has no vision. It's had no vision for a while. It focuses on fighting against early closures or on decommissioning. How am I, as a nuclear engineering lecturer, supposed to inspire new leading researchers or engineers to enter a field that's focused on getting rid of itself? And as for the public, if this is all you see, with no nuclear spokespersons talking about climate change, then you don't see nuclear as really wanting to participate in fighting climate change. The industry needs to start inspiring. It needs to be talking about its vision, its inspirations to grow, that nuclear doesn't simply intend to continue the decarbonisation of electricity, but also contribute to heating and industrial processes. This is what this slide shows here. Nuclear plants are remarkably adept at supplying process heat. But you wouldn't know if you're a member of the public. And that process heat can enable industrial processes like desalinization for drinking water. It can be used for producing synthetic fuels and hydrogen production that will be essential in decarbonizing our transport infrastructure. Renewables can't do that. They're variable and can only produce electricity. So they've got to get that electricity, and then it's got to be converted back to heat and so on and so forth to do the same job. And it's these processes that we've got to be promoting and spreading to the public. And it's the public's responsibility to understand the significance of such opportunities when formulating our position, our personal position on nuclear energy. And all of this will lead to a wider understanding of how nuclear reduces emissions, something we need to broadcast widely. And whilst doing so, we must all demand support from policymakers and legislators to ensure we are doing all we can to enable climate change mitigation through a fair market in clean energy where everyone is allowed to participate. Nuclear doesn't receive the equivalent support from environmental, social, and governance funding streams in comparison to other green energy sources. Such low-cost financing should be equally distributed across all green technologies. Don't put all eggs in one basket. That would enable nuclear to compete fairly, and we should be fighting for that. We need it in our fight against climate change. Investment in developing nuclear technology, which is desperately needed in the UK, shown in this graph here, shown to the House of Lords, should enable the rebirth of the nuclear sector, replicating the rate of new build that we saw in the 70s and 80s once again. Over the next few decades, if we got that new build, we'd ensure we achieve our net zero target and hopefully surpass it to achieve what we really need, which is negative emissions, because that's going to be our next goal, is to allow Earth to recover by actually reducing our total carbon dioxide equivalent concentration. My main point is we must all make an effort to learn and really think about nuclear and the opportunity it presents in our tackle against climate change. We need to reconsider our prejudices, but all our aspirations cannot be achieved if the nuclear industry itself doesn't have an inspiring vision on its own importance and potential. I want to see utilities proclaim the intention to expand their fleet. I don't want to see any more safety talk. Society doesn't care and doesn't want to know about nuclear safety culture. You're just promoting fear. If they have questions, brilliant, that's fine. Not a problem. Instead, what you need to do is you need to start recruiting people that know how to communicate. And that's not an engineer in most cases. Too many of us are sort of socially incompetent. By recruiting, rather than engineers, someone with a bit of a clever tongue, not only will this change public perception and in turn influence policymakers, but it'll allow engineers and scientists to take more pride in their role tackling climate change. Nuclear scientists spend their lives fighting a war without the appreciation they deserve. When a nuclear scientist tells someone, what they do, they're often bombarded with accusations of safety and waste problems, which is okay. If people don't understand, I really encourage to ask those questions. But that's not the problem. Scientists should be commended for their work and surviving this long against waves of public negativity and most importantly, legislators' lack of action. I want to see more discussions like that. I want to see that tonight, certainly in terms of the first half of the talk about how nuclear tackles climate change and, our desire for effective action. If just a few of us come out from tonight and spread this message, other people will hear it, and this leading example could be extremely valuable, especially when it's influencers doing it. Highly unlikely there's a celebrity here, but if that's what we need celebrities doing it, as unfortunately that's how our society works. We need famous politicians, rock stars, climate change scientists. It worked for Scientology. Why can't Tom Cruise become a lover of nuclear? I'm sure we could pay him enough. You see, everyone's different, and everyone's different, so people need different messages to engage them. So we need a broad range of communicators. I'm not enough. It's all about knowing your audience. I hope I've managed that today. I started by promoting having a few drinks at least, so I've softened you up a bit. But there is very little of that kind of thing I see in Germany, especially on what closing its nuclear plants means. But the German state, needs to be confronted with the fact that by closing their nuclear plants, they're not taking climate change seriously, and they're prioritizing something else instead. Regardless, the message we put out needs to explain that if you're anti-nuclear, it means you're against a proven way to mitigate climate change. Environmentalists are now coming on board with nuclear, but for decades, Greenpeace, for example, were anti-nuclear. But if it means they're against a proven way to mitigate climate change, as an environmentalist, that's indefensible for them. And hence, environmentalists are very quickly becoming pro-nuclear. And the funny thing is, everyone just assumes that an environmentalist knows what they're talking about. So if they're anti-nuclear, then nuclear must be bad for the environment, when, that is so clearly incorrect. But it's hard, it's hard to change something, someone's long held views on something. If you've ever had an argument about something like anti-vax or something like that, it's impossible to change their minds, regardless of how little scientific evidence they have to substantiate their claims. You're stuck. But over time, it can be done. And I think it's best done by giving people the opportunity alone to rethink their own ideas. And you just give them a little catalyst for that. It's no more prevalent, the need for that, than in politicians. We've seen recently that one such catalyst for that reconsideration, and that's through new technologies, namely advanced and small modular reactors. It's worked in Finland. Their politicians have changed. Nuclear is now regarded positively, both by the political elite and the public. Why couldn't that work here? In Finland, they've tackled the nuclear waste challenge very effectively, because nuclear waste issue is not a technological problem. It's certainly not a public health problem. It's a political problem. It's simply something politicians need to decide what to do with. And in Finland, they decided. They said to the industry, we need you to find a solution. They found a solution, they tested it, they modeled it, and hey presto, the Onkalo project was born. The politicians then came back and said, all right, let's do it. And that's why Finland has the first and only geological repository for nuclear waste. There's nothing stopping the UK doing the same. We know where we need to build it. It's in Cumbria. The hardest part is the politics. In the UK, as in Germany and many other states, politicians can prioritize the party and, very obviously themselves over all else. And if there's no personal or party gain to be had by being pro-nuclear or even talking about nuclear, which there isn't at the moment, then they're not going to talk about it. In fact, they end up having a lot to lose because they get attacked by anti-nuclear organizations if they say anything positive about nuclear. So politicians only have something to gain by saying something bad about nuclear, because that's seen as somehow the responsible thing to do. Finland are just more pragmatic. And it's this pragmatism that we need to replicate. Now, I seem to be burning my light. Oh dear. Sorry, old house. So, yeah, I don't want you to misunderstand me. The majority of EU member states are pro-nuclear. They either have their own nuclear plants, they want to build more, or, they want to build their first one. And it's these pro-nuclear states that need to shift their communications in Brussels away from the passive, the we are not opposed to nuclear, to the we are relying on nuclear to decarbonize our energy infrastructure, and we want it treated fairly in policy making. The anti-nuclear states, like Germany, Austria, Luxembourg, they're forever banding together and bullying other nations that want to have nuclear. And it's time that European majority get together and formulate a plan on how to align regulations and prevent the anti-nuclear states from making it difficult to grow nuclear power. And again, that comes down to whether you want to tackle climate change effectively or not. We need to build nuclear plants, so we need it to be easier, cheaper, and faster to do so. Rather than enabling anti-nuclear to promote the public's fear of accidents and radiation, we shouldn't spend so much time banging on about the perceived danger of radiation from power plants and the waste. If you've only been talking about it, then that's the only thing you'll think about. And that's why I haven't really talked about it today. If you don't understand nuclear safety or waste issues, then I know you'll ask about it. So it's a much better way of moving forward. I want to resolve those issues, but I'm not going to raise it as my first topic in a talk. I need to hear under what context you're asking about it in. That's the only way I can resolve that fear. And depending on who asks the question, I'll customize my answer to most effectively resolve it. Taking in technical terms doesn't work for a lot of people, but it works for some. If I'm talking to a greengrocer, I'm going to, fitting slide to have, I'm going to discuss radiation dose in terms of banana equivalents. There's radioactive potassium in bananas. Greengrocer knows about bananas. How many bananas do I need to eat to get the equivalent dose of living next to a nuclear plant? And that's a feasible number. And it really works. Doesn't quite work when you're talking about Chernobyl. People can't really think in that many bananas. You need equivalent cigarettes for that. But it's about engaging with something people will remember and have an emotional response to. Bananas are funny, they're radioactive. That's a great aid. If I could teach with more bananas, I would. But they don't pay me enough to buy all those bananas. So really, let's conclude. Nuclear has its challenges, but we need nuclear if we are to tackle climate change. It's a proven method to reduce carbon emissions on a large scale. The challenges it's had are being resolved, but we need fair investment and legislation to enable any progress. We have designs for new nuclear reactors that solve a lot of the issues. Small reactors, small modular reactors that take less time and money to get started, or next generation technologies that turn radioactive waste into new fuel. But so far, they've not been deployed at a scale where they can have a significant impact on the nuclear sector because political issues and the dysfunctional communications with the public prevent that. If we do decide to build new reactors, they don't have to be the same giant installations that cost billions. These small reactors are an option. They're much cheaper. They use the latest technology to improve their safety. But again, we need everyone on board in fighting climate change, from politicians to the public. And we need to demand progress. And the best progression we can have is to invest in nuclear plants now, developing renewables at the same time, and actually practice what we preach before it's frankly too late. We the public, we need to embrace this lifelong learning. We all have a role in making a responsible effort to understand the issues around us and promote a culture of education and due consideration. And in doing so, we ensure we understand our goals and are all on board. And then we can call our legislators to account. We want action, and we need it. It's going to be a long battle. Climate change, can't be resolved in a couple of years. We're talking decades and most likely centuries. But it's now or never for us to embrace this revolution. We should, I want to be remembered as one of those that turned things around and embraced nuclear before we become generations that are known as having the opportunity to save Earth, but those that didn't take it.